Welcome to our first session here today. My name is Dr. Michelle Newman and I'm a Goals and Research Fellow here at Autistica. I'm really excited to kick off today's webinar where we're going to be exploring early executive function development in children with family connection to autism. For those of you who are new to our sessions, Autistica is the UK's leading autism research and campaigning charity. We exist to create breakthroughs that enable all autistic people to live happier, healthier and longer lives. We work with autistic people to fund research and to shape policy. To make sure that that evidence that is generated through research has a real world impact on improving people's lives. A big part of that is about sharing what that latest research is and what evidence-based practice looks like, which is what the purpose of these webinars are all about. So to our main event, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Alexandra Hendry, who is going to be discussing the new project called Start With Us. I'm going to let Alex introduce herself a bit more and then at the end of the session we'll be doing a Q&A session, so please do feel free to drop any questions as they come up. But yeah, over to you, Alex.
Brilliant. Okay, so I'm just going to attempt to share my screen. That looks like it's worked, so let me just shuffle some bits about so I can see everything clearly and then we can get going. All right, so welcome to this webinar on supporting early executive function development. In which I'll be discussing firstly what we've discovered about the development of attention, regulation and thinking skills in the context of autism and ADHD, and then outlining a new programme to support toddler skill development. So I'll start this webinar by outlining what we mean by executive functions and why we think they're so very important, and I'll then present the results from recent research into executive function development amongst children with a family history of autism or ADHD. And then I'll outline how via the START programme, we're attempting to support children with a connection to autism or ADHD to develop stronger executive functions using a neurodiversity-affirming approach. And just to note, in this webinar, I'll be using primarily identity-first language, so autistic people rather than people with autism, as that's the language that tends to be preferred by autistic people. Okay, so executive functions are the thinking and regulation skills that underpin our ability to set and work towards goals. And there are lots of different elements to executive functions and different ways of breaking them down. But one common way is to think about executive functions in terms of three core elements: inhibitory control, cognitive flexibility, and working memory. So let's look at each of these in turn. We can start with inhibitory control. At its most basic, inhibitory control is what gives us the ability to stop, to not touch, to resist temptation. But it's also what gives us the ability to withhold one action and produce a different action instead. So one way of thinking about this might be, imagine you're in a very big building with a kind of long corridor and lots of doors. So perhaps a hospital with a long walkway. And you might be going through a series of doors, which are all push doors. So you walk a bit, you push the door, you walk on, you push the next door. And then after 5 or 6 doors, you see a new door, which has a handle and perhaps even a pull sign. And you need to produce a different response. And it actually takes quite a lot of inhibitory control to stop that last response, the response that has been kind of useful up until that point, in order to produce an alternative response. And that requires inhibitory control. Meanwhile, working memory, we can think about as kind of maybe our ability to perform a mental juggling act. So working memory involves holding some information in mind and then manipulating it or updating it in some way. For example, when we're doing mental maths or following directions. And cognitive flexibility is what gives us the ability to mentally change gear, to act first in one way to a given situation, and then when some new information comes in, to act in a different way. So let's think about what this means for day-to-day life. I'm going to attempt to do a bit of an interactive poll here. So what I'd like you to do, if you can, is to go to the Poll Everywhere site. So if you follow the link at the top of the screen here, pollev.com/Alexandra Hendry 356, and it's 356, not 365, which might have kind of sprung to mind. If you visit that link, it should prompt you to input some answers to this question: when do we use executive functions as adults? So I've started us off with a few suggestions, but I'd really love to get your input. When you can come up with some examples of when you use executive functions as an adult. And what I've noticed about Poll Everywhere is if you're using a phrase it splits it. So try and put one of those underscores if between your words, if you're using multiple words. Is what I mean. I'll just give you guys a moment to see if you can input some things there. Cooking a roast dinner, yeah. So to do that, you've got to kind of plan all the different steps. You've got to be thinking about the timings, holding in mind, oh, this went in there. Next, I've got to do that. You've got to maybe manage your emotions if something boils over and it looks like it's all going to go wrong. Right, we've got lots of others. We've got planning, yeah. We've got getting ready. We've got making decisions. We've got following directions, shopping, budgeting, yeah, definite working memory demands there, holding in mind lots of different pieces of information, driving, parking, getting the kids ready, yep, nappy changes, yeah, you're bringing everything together, having a plan of action, and then when the child has a different plan, being able to respond flexibly to meet their needs. So lots and lots of different ideas there. That's really brilliant. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next one, which is thinking about, well, when do children use executive functions? So they might be not doing those very sophisticated activities. They might not be cooking a roast dinner, but can you come up with some examples of when they might be using executive functions in their day-to-day life? So hopefully that will automatically take you through to the next link. It looks like people have already found that, so that's great. So we've got getting dressed, yeah, planning the different components and then being able to put one thing on in one way and then putting your trousers on in a different way. Imaginary play, lots of executive demands in that. Doing your homework, yeah, you've got to have a goal in mind and you've got to resist the impulse to do something else and resist distractions. Brushing your teeth, yeah, crossing the road, making breakfast, taking turns, toileting, doing schoolwork, lots and lots of Minecraft, yeah, it's a really rich activity, Minecraft, lots of executive function demands in there. Brilliant. Okay, lovely. So I shall mull all of those over after the session. So if you want to keep putting in other examples, that's brilliant. But I'll crack on because I think that's given us a real sense that there are lots of different day-to-day tasks that involve executive functions. But what I wanted to flag is that they are more than just productivity skills. So not only are executive functions important for our day-to-day life, but they're also really, really important to our mental health and to our quality of life. So for example, strong executive functions have been associated with greater school success, with well-being and with physical health, but executive function difficulties have also been linked to poor mental health. And this is a real problem because people with autism and people with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder often experience executive function difficulties. As I'm sure most people on this webinar know, autism and ADHD are overlapping and heritable. So by which I mean someone who's autistic is more likely to have ADHD as well and vice versa, but also they tend to cluster in families. So a child with an autistic first-degree relative is more likely than average to have ADHD and vice versa. And executive function difficulties are a genetically influenced link that might explain some of this overlap. So for that reason, in a lot of this webinar, I'll be talking about both autism and ADHD. Now, it's really important to note at this point that differences are not inherently bad, and research has had a very dubious history of comparing neurotypical people with autistic people, finding a difference, and therefore labeling that difference as indicative of a problem. So we don't want to be doing that. But that said, it does seem to be the case that the executive function differences associated with autism and ADHD do tend to cause difficulties with some aspects of day-to-day life and have been specifically linked to poor mental health and lower quality of life. So for example, executive function difficulties are linked to poor mental health and lower quality of life in autism, but also in ADHD. So by understanding how and when these difficulties first come about, we're one step closer to understanding what interventions might be useful to boost development in areas likely to cause difficulties in later life, and what environmental support should be put in place to help young children live happy, healthy, fulfilling lives. And if we're interested in thinking about how and when executive function difficulties first emerge, we need to look really quite early in development. So toddlers might not be able to do all the tasks that came up in those word clouds earlier, but within the first few years of life, what we do see is the development of the ability to control one's own attention, resist some impulses, and adapt responses to different situations. And these early abilities go on to support later skills, so that children with strong executive functions by age 3 tend to have stronger executive functions by school age and adolescence, which in turn have benefits for academic success, mental health, and general well-being. So what can we find out about executive functions and autism early in development? Well, our first challenge, of course, is to find the right children to observe. Now, the average age of childhood autism diagnosis in the UK is around 4.5 years, and is very rarely below 2 years, whilst the average age of childhood ADHD diagnosis in the UK is around 10.5, and is very rarely below 5 years. And so if we just randomly sampled 100 children from the population, we could only expect one of our sample to actually be autistic and between 2 and 7 to have ADHD. But because autism is highly heritable, if we specifically sample infants who have an older brother or sister who is autistic, we can expect around 12 to 20 of those infants to later receive a diagnosis of autism themselves, and a further 30% to show elevated but subclinical traits and or atypical development, often including these executive function difficulties. And because ADHD is also heritable, if we also collect a sample of infants with a family history of ADHD, we can expect similar patterns of elevated rates of ADHD as well as elevated rates of autism. And so this sibling design approach has been used in the BASIS network, which stands for the British Autism Study of Infant Siblings. BASIS has been going for many, many years now. And in the most recent phase, the study design was expanded to also include infants with a family history of ADHD. We collect data when infants are 5, 10, 15, 25, and 37 months old. So as you can imagine, the BASE study is a kind of a massive collaborative effort involving researchers looking at many different areas using many different methods. And I'll be showing you just one facet of this, focusing on my particular interest in attention and its role in executive function development. And what I thought I'd start with is sharing with you the results of 2 studies conducted within BASIS. The first one looking at attentional control in infancy, the second one using lab-based measures of executive functions in toddlerhood. So why attentional control? Well, there's extensive evidence to suggest that it's a foundational component of executive function. Attentional control in infancy predicts executive function skills in toddlerhood and beyond. And one way of measuring attentional control is through parent reports. In other words, asking parents to fill in a questionnaire to share how their child behaves in different situations. Now, there are lots of potential advantages to parent report, which in the interest of time, I won't go into, but it gives us a sense of what's going on in the child's day-to-day life, which can be very useful. Now, existing research using parent report of attentional control has found evidence for difficulties with attentional focus and attention shifting amongst autistic children from age 2 years onwards. And it's been found that lower attentional focus and attention shifting scores at age 2 for toddlers with a family of history of autism generally, but also those later diagnosed as autistic especially. But what we haven't found is evidence for group differences in terms of autism family history or autism outcomes as early as 10 months. So why might that be? Why don't we see attentional differences earlier in infancy? Well, one way of thinking about it is perhaps we shouldn't be looking at differences at a single point in time in infancy. Perhaps what we should be looking for is differences in development, and maybe genuine differences amongst children with a family history of autism are masked by what we call heterogeneity in the group. So the fact that, infants are very, very varied. So perhaps it would be more useful to consider the question in terms of development of attention, with a large enough sample to say perhaps some groups of infants are developing in a different way to others. So that's what we've tried to do in this study. And so in order to do that, I needed a big sample. So I was able to combine data from all 3 phases of BASIS, giving me a sample of nearly 300 infants, 212 of whom had a family history of autism, and 82 had no family history of autism. And we used data collected when infants were 6 to 9 months, 15 months, and 25 months old. And we used this parent report of attention. So we use scales called the duration of orienting scale, of the IBQ, of the infant time points. But by toddlerhood, we can start to ask kind of more complex questions about attentional behavior, splitting it out into aspects of attentional focus, so maintaining attention on a target, and attention shifting, so being able to redirect attention between different targets and return back to a task after your attention has been pulled elsewhere. So I won't kind of go into details of the statistical analysis, but basically what I was using is latent class analysis, which is a data-driven approach. So it allows us to take a big jumble of babies and identify clusters of infants who are similar to each other with regards to the characteristic of interest. And in this case, it's development of attention. And we run this analysis without kind of inputting details about family history or diagnostic outcome. Instead, we're trying to group children on the basis of their attentional control. Now, what I'm going to do is kind of whistle through some results here, and I'm very aware that some people listening to this webinar will be very keen to see graphs and statistical analyses, and some will just want the summary. So if you're in the latter group, just let the detail wash over you for a moment, and I'll draw out the key conclusions very shortly. So what we did was we asked three main questions. The first was, is there evidence for a subgroup of infants who show unusual development of control of attention? So we used the statistical approach to split the data set into groups known as classes, and we used model fit statistics to decide when to stop. And this suggested that there were 4 classes, 4 groups of infants. The majority of infants fell into class 2. So we labeled this the normative class. We're not making judgments about whether this is good or bad, just that it's the most common profile. This is what most children's development looks like. And then you can see that around a sixth of the sample had high scores at 8 and 15 months, and similar proportion had low scores at 8 and 15 months. But by 25 months, and that's the period where our attentional control skills are really starting to tightly map to our executive function skills, by that point, their scores for both attentional focus and attention shifting had converged, kind of were looking similar to the normative group. So it would suggest that perhaps the key point, the point at which groups start to diverge, is actually at around 2. In contrast, there's this smallest group, about 1/14 of the sample, who looked like they had kind of fairly typical attentional scores at 8 months, but actually this slightly declined during the period that we might have been expecting our executive attention network to kick in and start influencing behavior. And by 25 months, this group was showing significantly lower attentional focus and attention shifting scores. We labeled this group the plateaued attention class. And this plateaued attention class not only had significantly lower attentional focus scores at age 3 years compared with all the other classes. So, this kind of slower development of attentional control in toddlerhood was predictive of lower attentional control at age 3. But also, this group had higher SRS2 scores. So that's indicative of elevated autism traits compared with the normative class. Higher ADHD trait scores, indicative of a pathway towards ADHD. Wouldn't necessarily be characterizing these children as having ADHD at this early age, but compared with the normative class, higher ADHD traits, and lower Vineland ABC scores. So this is a measure of adaptive function, so a child's kind of ability to do the kind of day-to-day behaviors that we might expect of this developmental age group. So this plateaued attention class had lower adaptive functioning compared with the normative attentional control class. So this seems to be quite interesting, but the problem with identifying subgroups in this kind of way is we quickly run into low group sizes. So we only have 20 infants from that original large sample in the plateau development class. And also it's possible that these data-driven classes could be sample specific. So to increase confidence in the results, I ran a pre-registered replication. So I kind of wrote down and published up front what I thought would be the prediction in a new sample of infants. And this was drawn from the EuroSIBS consortium. So children drawn from across Europe, in Sweden, Belgium, the Netherlands, and a new sample in the UK. And we had a total of 412 infants, so a slightly larger sample than in the discovery sample. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through each of the classes other than to say that once again, we found this plateaued attentional control class, this time comprising 9% of the sample. And this plateaued attentional development class had once again higher autism traits compared with the normative class, higher ADHD traits compared with the normative class, and lower adaptive functioning scores compared with the normative class. And exploratory analysis also found that infants who were later diagnosed with autism were 4 times more likely to be classified to the plateaued attention development class compared to undiagnosed infants with a family history of autism. But the majority of autistic infants were in the normative class. So in summary, infants who have a family history of autism do indeed show a range of profiles of development of attentional control. Those infants who seem to show this kind of plateaued development of attentional control, those infants tend to show higher autistic and ADHD traits. But it's also worth noting that only a minority of infants later diagnosed with autism show atypical development of attentional control. So not all autistic children will have shown attentional differences in infancy. So that gives us some insights into those very early years. But what about toddlerhood, when children begin to show more complex behaviours and we can really begin to talk about executive functions properly? We wanted to know, do toddlers showing high autistic traits show difficulties with executive functions? So as I said before, by age 2, toddlers are in general able to control their own attention, resist some impulses, adapt their responses to different situations. So I put together a batch of tasks and games, drawing on some existing measures created by other researchers and some new ones that I developed myself to tap into those abilities. Each of these tasks and games were designed to be as engaging as possible, but also to be just difficult enough that we'd get variation in children's performance. And they were also designed to have fairly low language and social demands so that children who aren't yet talking or who don't find social interaction interesting or engaging wouldn't be unfairly disadvantaged. And if you'd like to hear more about those tasks, feel free to ask me questions during the Q&A or to contact me over email afterwards. So we collected data from a total of 161 children, of whom 127 were seen when they were 2 years old and 122 were seen when they were 3 years old, with roughly equal numbers of boys and girls. And once again, the majority of our sample had a family history of autism or ADHD. I'm not going to be presenting group comparisons here, but focusing on those associations between autism traits and executive functions across this diverse group of toddlers. So at each visit, we measured children's autism traits in 2 ways. Parent report using the Q-chat at the 2-year visit and the SRS2 at the 3-year visit, and semi-structured observation using the ADOS, which is a kind of standardized observational measure of autism. And just to give you a bit of a frame of reference for these data, the Q-chat has a possible range of 0 to 100 and a clinical cutoff of 39, whereas on the SRS2, T-scores of 60 or above are considered indicative of autism. So we've really got a broad range in this particular sample, which is what we were hoping for. Now, the data I'm presenting here has not yet been published or reviewed by other scientists, so please keep in mind that these are very preliminary findings. And with that in mind, the preliminary result that we find at age 2 is that toddlers who are already showing high autistic traits tend to score lower on the measures of inhibitory control, but aren't showing signs of difficulty with cognitive flexibility or working memory. By age 3, toddlers who are already showing high parent-reported autistic traits tend to score lower on all aspects of executive function. Although if you take into account that we're actually doing lots of statistical tests here, the results are only really robust for associations between autism traits and working memory. I was also really interested to see whether autism traits seem to be predicting executive function difficulties or vice versa. And we do find a small predictive association between inhibitory control and autism traits. But once you take into account, again, that we're doing lots of statistical tests here, the results aren't very robust. But in contrast, we do find that autism traits at age 2 are predictive of lower inhibitory control scores at age 3, lower cognitive flexibility scores, and lower working memory scores at age 3. So what we can conclude from these preliminary findings is that executive function autism associations emerge first for inhibitory control, but by age 3 years are also evident for working memory and cognitive flexibility. It also seems to be the case that autistic traits appear to precede these executive function difficulties, which leads me to conclude that children showing elevated autism traits by age 2 years may benefit from additional support in executive function development. Now, as I said, the tasks and games in the study that I just described were created to be as engaging as possible, and they were deliberately designed to enable us to investigate associations between autism traits and different components of executive function. But the downside of this kind of approach is that it's not really that representative of how children use executive functions in day-to-day life. Does it really matter if a child can't find all the treasure in the treasure hunt game or predict what side of the screen a cartoon is going to show up in? Well, to address this, we conducted another study with a different group of toddlers to ask, do children showing high autistic traits show differences in day-to-day executive function related behaviours? in infancy or toddlerhood, again within a sample of children with a family history of autism or ADHD. So in this study, we used the Early Executive Functions Questionnaire. This is a new measure that assesses child cognitive and regulatory abilities via 28 items relating to child behaviour. So we're asking parents to report on their children's behaviour, thinking about the last 2 weeks, and they report that on a 7-point scale, where 1 is, no, my child never does this, they never behave like this, and 7 is, yep, that's spot on, that's how my child is always like. Additionally, parents are asked to complete 3 tasks involving weighting, finding and sorting to elicit the kind of behaviours that might just spontaneously occur a little less frequently in day-to-day life, and therefore are less easy for parents to report on reliably, but we think are still important for day-to-day functioning. Now, if you're interested in reading about the validation of the EEFQ, you can follow up the reference here, and the measure is free to download from the Open Science Framework, but do get in touch with me directly if you'd like to use it, as I can share some tips and tools to help with that. Now, what we found in this study across several different studies now is that scores can be grouped together into, on the one hand, a cognitive executive function score. So this is the items that we're designed to map to inhibitory control, cognitive flexibility and working memory. So we can refer to these as maybe thinking skills. And then a separate regulation score, which relates to children's ability to recover from extremes of emotions. And both of these scores have high internal consistency and have been demonstrated in other samples to be pretty stable over a 3 to 6 month period. So we think we're capturing something fairly meaningful about children's behaviour and abilities. The sample for this particular study included 136 UK parents who have children aged 9 to 37 months, who have at least 1 first-degree blood relative with a diagnosis of autism or ADHD. So that could be a child, or it could be the parent themselves. Participants were recruited through the University of Oxford Baby Lab volunteer database, through social media and through Prolific, which is an online recruitment platform. And what happened was, after giving their consent and filling out demographic questionnaires, parents completed either the Autism Parenting Screen for Infants questionnaire, which is a validated parent report measure for children aged 6 to 24 months. And that's got 26 items covering a broad span of behavioural patterns that are usually associated with autism. Or if the child was older than that, if they were 24 months and older, they were asked to complete the QChat, the quantitative checklist for autism in toddlers. And that is aiming to capture similar behaviours, but is designed to be suitable for slightly older toddlers. And then we also asked all parents to complete the EEFQ, the Early Executive Functions Questionnaire. So this work is being led by my amazing research assistant, Marina Nosik. And once again, I need to flag that these data haven't yet been published or reviewed by other scientists. So please keep in mind that these are really preliminary findings. These are hot off the press. But what we found in terms of our preliminary findings is that for 9 to 23-month-olds, we don't find a significant association between autism traits and parent-reported executive functions. But by the toddlerhood period, so 24 to 37-month-olds, we do find that high autistic traits are associated with lower cognitive executive function scores and with lower regulation scores. Now, of course, this begs the question, why didn't we find associations between executive functions and autistic traits in infancy? Is it because early executive functions are just emerging and maybe too unstable to capture them accurately? Is it that differences in executive function related behaviours, or perhaps autism related behaviours, are just so subtle in infancy that parents aren't able to accurately report them, and we need to go back to the lab to really get a good index of these? Or is it the case that executive function autism associations truly only emerge in toddlerhood? So we do need to dig into that a bit more with some further research to answer that question. But in the meantime, these preliminary findings do seem to corroborate our earlier finding from the lab-based measures that autism executive function associations are evident by age 2 to 3 years in children with a family history of autism or ADHD, and that children showing elevated autism traits by age 2 years might benefit from additional support in executive function development. So now we can begin to answer the questions that I posed at the start of this talk. What supports might be useful to help children live happy, healthy, fulfilling lives? Well, I would argue that support with the development of attentional control, cognitive executive functions, and regulation skills is likely to benefit all children, and particularly those who might otherwise have difficulties with executive functions, and that this support should include opportunities to practice skill development. But given that executive function difficulties seem to be at least in part genetically constrained, we also need to be thinking about environmental adaptations and accommodations to meet children where they're at. In other words, we need to create opportunities for skill development without placing unrealistic demands on the child and inadvertently perpetuating the untrue message that you can develop strong executive functions if you just try hard enough. So who should be supported and when? Well, if we wait until they're 2 years or older, we could absolutely focus just on toddlers showing early autistic traits. But if we want to intervene before executive function difficulties have emerged, we should consider supporting toddlers at an elevated likelihood of autism or ADHD by virtue of having a family history of autism or ADHD. So this thinking, informed by the findings that I've just presented, have led to the development of the START programme, which stands for Supporting Toddlers with a Family Connection to Autism or ADHD to Develop Strong Attention, Regulation and Thinking Skills. START is a collaboration with the People Charity, which via its national network of early years practitioners supports thousands of families each year to support their children's development. And the People ethos, the reason I wanted to collaborate with them on this project is that what families do in daily life has a huge impact on child outcomes. And this has been borne out time and time again by other people's research, but also my own research conducted during the pandemic, just illustrating the importance of the home learning environment and what families do on a day-to-day basis for children's development. Now, people have been supporting families to support their own children for over 20 years, so they have a wealth of experience and expertise to draw upon from START. But specifically in this programme, we've set out to create a neurodiversity-affirming programme, which embraces the diversity of thought, experience and behaviour associated with autism and ADHD. So it's not about making children less neurodivergent, but which addresses factors which do negatively impact on children's well-being. We've also worked very hard to minimise costs and maximise benefits for all potential participants. So what I mean by this is that Catherine Pye and others have kind of done research into what the impacts of interventions are on families. So Catherine's presented this really lovely piece of work at INSAR recently, based on questionnaires, but also follow-up interviews with caregivers of autistic preschoolers. She's based in Australia, but many of the themes she identifies chime with what I've been hearing from parents in a UK context, which is that even the most well-meaning interventions come with costs. In particular, she identified that accessing support requires time and mental or emotional capacity that they can only find by foregoing other priorities. So we need to keep that in mind in order to develop inclusive, accessible supports, which place as low a burden on parents as possible, whilst designing those supports to be beneficial to the families taking part. And the way that we've tried to do that for START is by starting with theory and cutting-edge research into early executive function development in children with a family history of autism or ADHD, but letting the programme be shaped by the community. And so we've done that through this kind of iterative process shown here on the slide, that's led towards 3 components of what we might call the theory of change. What are we trying to do and why? So first, we're trying to provide play-based opportunities to embed executive function skill practice across contexts, but in ways that are appropriate to individual strengths, challenges and interests. And of course, that's really important because this, as we've seen, is a really, really diverse group. Some children will be struggling with their executive functions already, others may be flying, and they just need a few little nudges and supports and encouragement. And also these activities need to be accessible and appropriate for families from diverse backgrounds. So we've put a lot of effort into getting input from families with a range of cultural backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, neurodiverse backgrounds, to really think about how can these activities be adapted to meet the needs of individual families. Kind of the second component of our theory of change is that we value what parents are already doing to support their child. And we use coaching and peer support techniques to promote parenting behaviours that are linked to strong executive functions, but we do that within a neurodiversity affirming context. So not assuming that there is a right or a wrong way to behave, or that neurotypical like parenting approaches are better than more neurodivergent characteristics. And then thirdly, we empower parents to consider how they can improve environmental fit for their child, so that executive function stresses and executive function demands are reduced. And this was really kind of encouraged as a component by the community advisory group. So we talked long and hard about how if you're already overwhelmed, experiencing sensory overwhelm, if you're anxious, if you're stressed, if you're tired, you're not going to be in a good place to practice your executive function skills. So first and foremost, the child must be supported to feel safe, to feel comfortable, to feel accommodated, and then given opportunities to practice those skills. So with this in mind, we've developed a programme that involves 12 weekly sessions for parents of 21 to 30-month-olds. Each week, early years practitioners lead a group discussion around an aspect of executive function, but using kind of really simple day-to-day terms. And we share ideas for ways to help toddlers develop those skills. Every session involves a mixture of hands-on games and activities for toddlers, and each activity can be adapted to suit the needs and interests and motivations of the families themselves. And we give takeaway resources and ideas for parents to adapt to suit their child at home. The programme structure is built around the idea of building blocks, where we gradually introduce key skills, starting with those basic attentional control skills and building up each week. And there's opportunities to recap and to catch up on missed sessions, because we recognise that life is complex. You can't necessarily come each week to a group session. And guiding the ethos of the programme is this dual emphasis on play and peer support. So whilst the sessions are led by trained early years practitioners, the aim is for parents to feel empowered to support each other in sharing not only what they're struggling with, but also what they're already doing that works well. And that's been really successful in the pilot so far. And we've been funded by NIHR, so National Institute of Health and Care Research, to run a feasibility randomised control of the START programme. In phase 1, we ran 2 pilot rounds of the START programme in Oxford. So this involved 13 families in total, most of whom had a family history of autism or ADHD. But on request and in the light of the research findings I've just presented, we also expanded the eligibility criteria to include toddlers with high autistic traits, even if they don't have a known family history of autism or ADHD. And the results from the pilot rounds indicate that both parents and toddlers find the programme engaging, supportive, and enjoyable. So we can see some nice anecdotes from parents here. You'll see that just one parent found the session ideas not very useful, but that's because she was already using those activity ideas and had already kind of embraced the principles, which is great. That there's no point in stopping parents from doing the wonderful things that they're already doing. But the majority of parents rated the session ideas as being very useful across sessions and across pilot groups. So we're now recruiting for the feasibility RCT. And so the aim here is to check that it's feasible to run a randomized control trial with this population. So a randomized control trial is where you split your group into some receiving the support program and some not, so that you can compare the effects. And we need to check that our strategy for recruitment and data collection all makes sense before we do that on a massive large scale. So at this point, we're recruiting 60 families in total. All 60 families will be invited for assessments before and after the programme, but only 30 families are randomised to take part in the programme itself. And we're going to be running 5 groups with 6 to 8 families in each group. And 3 of these groups will be based in Oxford, with recruitment having already started because the first programme round is starting in September. And our second site will be coming on board in January. So we'll be recruiting for that soon. So here's how the process for the RCT phase works. We start by the parent gets in touch with us. Maybe they've heard about the programme through their health visitor, through flyers, through social media, through their nursery key people. They complete a very short screening questionnaire for us, 5 minutes, to talk about their family history and whether their child is showing high autistic traits. And then we schedule a baseline assessment when the child is 20 months. And that gives us a really good sense of the child's existing strengths and difficulties with executive functions. And we also do some standardized assessments for developmental level and autistic traits. And we have ethics approval to share those results back with parents should they so wish, so that if they're already pursuing a diagnosis or have been talking to other practitioners about, is this child showing signs of autistic traits, this is just giving them a little bit more information to help process that and continue it if appropriate. After the assessment, the family is randomized by a separate member of the team to either receive START or usual practice. So in both cases, there's nothing stopping the families accessing any other supports that are available. So if for example, the child has speech delays and would benefit from specialist SLT support, then there's absolutely nothing stopping them accessing that, whichever arm of the program they're in. Then if they are randomized to receive START, that is a 3-month program, so that families are asked to turn up as many weeks as possible over this 3-month period and complete a very short weekly questionnaire to let us know how that's going and how they're finding the program. And then after that program has finished, when the child is about 31 months, we ask them to do another set of questionnaires to tell us how the child's getting on, followed by a follow-up assessment when the child is 36 months old. And there we do an even more comprehensive kind of look at the child's executive function strengths and difficulties, as well as these standardized measures of autism traits. And so clearly there's a lot involved in that program. So returning to this idea about kind of minimizing burden on families, we've tried to do this in lots of ways. We're covering travel expenses, both to the program themselves if they're randomized to receive START, but also to the research assessment visits. And we also offer home visits if that's preferred for the pre and post assessments. We provide vouchers as a token of appreciation for parents' time and effort in completing questionnaires. And we put lots of effort into making the research and group settings as inclusive and accessible as possible, from providing autistic-led training in inclusivity for all team members, to checking venues for sensory hazards, and talking with parents about if there's anything that we can do to make the session, whether the settings or the activities, more accessible for them and their child. So just before I wrap up, I'd like to say a massive thank you to the parents and children who've contributed to this research, and to the members of the START advisory group who've so generously shared their experience and expertise. They really have shaped this programme for the better. I'd also like to acknowledge the many, many collaborators who've made this research possible, from my PhD supervisors and current fellowship mentors to other researchers in the BASIS network. Thank you to Autistica for hosting this webinar, and to my funders, and thank you for listening. So I think we'll open up the floor for any questions at this point, but you can also get in touch with me via email after the session as well.
Thank you, Alexandra, for that talk. That was really interesting. Executive function is, I think, yeah, such a key area of understanding in terms of cognitive functioning that I think is really important to spend more time looking at. So the Q&A and the chat is open. If you do have trouble using the Q&A function, feel free to drop any questions that you've got into the chat box. I'm going to start with a couple of questions while we're waiting for any questions that people have to come in. I'm wondering if you could maybe just talk a little bit more about what those executive function challenges at the early ages look like. What kind of tasks is it that we see differences?
Sure. Okay. So in terms of in the lab, we do a mixture of things. One of the simplest ones is what we call a prohibition task, where we put a toy down in front of the child and we say, no, don't touch. And, you know, it's developmentally appropriate that most children will touch, you know, these are exciting toys and they'll grab. But what tends to happen is that some children age out of that and they begin to develop this ability to resist the impulse to touch and to wait. Other children find that really, really hard. Either they just go straight for it, or they get distressed. So it's just too overwhelming for them to meet that demand. So that's one kind of activity. But we also have touchscreen games that are about holding information in mind, following alternating rules. And you get some really interesting profiles of kind of sticky responses. So responding in a way that was previously successful, but not being able to update that and moving on to find a different successful location. And you know, my favourite game to play with toddlers is this game called Spin the Pots by Hughes and Ensor, where we have treasure that we hide in different pots and we cover it, and then one turn at a time, children get to find the treasure. And once again, some children are really great at that, better than me often. They can kind of find all 6 pieces of treasure, and then I'm like, oh, I thought there was one there. Whereas other children, they get really stuck and they just return to the same pot over and over again. And so it's kind of interesting that you get these different profiles. Sometimes a child can be really strong in one area and struggle in other areas. And we see that in the START pilots as well, that there are children who maybe are really struggling with impulse control and turn taking and maybe the kind of emotion regulation side of things, But what we can do and start is identify where their strengths are. So some children actually love puzzles, and we can use that to kind of build their self-esteem first, and then start building in maybe elements of turn taking into that, so practice the area that is more challenging to them.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I was thinking when you were saying that classic test that I think we've seen on TV or on Instagram with the marshmallow or with the sweets very often, that I'm sure lots of people have seen before. So we've had a few questions that have come in now. We've had one question from Fiona, who has asked, what about strategies to improve executive function in older children? Obviously we've talked about preschool children here, but what about children that now are struggling with those that might be of school age?
So I guess broadly, I think some of the same principles apply, that it's about, on the one hand, going, okay, well, what adjustments do we need to make to the environment so that the child isn't emotionally overtaxed from the outset? Because none of us do well when we're stressed, when we're tired, when we're overwhelmed. So adjusting the context first, and then giving them opportunities to practice their executive functions, whilst maybe putting some supports in place so that they have opportunities to practice being successful. So, using visual timetables, using reminders. I would direct you to the EPIC website. It's from the University of Edinburgh. They've developed a whole kind of suite of tools for parents and teachers to support more school-age children who have executive function challenges. So that's a great resource, and I believe the resources are free to download. So that's the University of Edinburgh EPIC team.
Brilliant. Well, we'll have to have a look for that link and see if we can get that sent out to people. So another question we've had from Renee, who has asked, did you always find a correlation between task switching and task focus, or sometimes were there different results in each?
That's a really good question. It ought to be the case, shouldn't it, that if you're able to control your attention really well and listen to your instructions, that you're then able to perform better on the next bit of the task. Doesn't seem to be that straightforward. So we have children in the lab sometimes where I'm like, oh, do you know what? I'm not sure if anything's gone in there. It looked like their attention is all over the place, but actually they're flying. There was a piece of research that I didn't have time to squeeze into the presentation, where we have presented a problem-solving box task to children with and without a family history of ADHD. And the children with a family history of ADHD actually do better than their peers on that task. They're more generative, they come up with more different strategies, they are on it. And as a consequence, they're more successful, they retrieve more rewards than their peers without a family history of ADHD. So there may be advantages of actually having maybe slightly more scattered attention and not showing that initial focus, particularly if you can design tasks and activities in day-to-day life in a way that don't necessarily require sitting still and concentrating to complex rules. So again, it's about thinking, well, what does this mean for day-to-day life? Because these two are slightly disconnected, can we find ways to support the children who might be struggling in one area, but would nevertheless be great at, hunting games and problem solving?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that tapped into one of the questions that I was thinking about as well. Is what are we hoping to look at in terms of the long-term data? I'm assuming that you'd be wanting to look and see what happens longer term.
Yeah, it's always a challenge with funding, that we get funded for short-term periods, but absolutely, I'd really like to understand what impacts does this have for the child at school, the child's emotional well-being, how well they're doing in their families, because we hear a lot about families where one child's executive function difficulties impacts on the rest of the family, and that can lead to quite fraught situations. So if we can support children to manage their emotions in ways that feel better for everyone, does that have a knock-on benefit both for the child and for the broader family? That's what we would hope, but we have to encourage funders to kind of give us funding to do that long-term follow-up. Absolutely.
The challenges of research constantly. Yeah. We have one final question that's come in from Joe, has said, how and using what terminology could parents use to get support for executive functioning into an EHCP?
That is a really good question. I think I'm going to have to go away and ponder that because I don't think you would be the only person who would want to know that. And I think that needs maybe a more measured response. So let me go away and have a think about that. Perhaps that's a piece of research that probably needs to be done. It is something that we're already talking to kind of policymakers and commissioners about. Well, what are the programs that are on offer and how does this fit within the other pieces? Yeah, I will go away and I'll think about that a bit more if I may.
No, that's really interesting actually, though. Yeah, what are your long-term plans with this? Actually, you mentioned policy. What are you hoping would be the longer-term plans with the work?
So, I mean, first and foremost, we need to make sure that this is, you know, appropriate and useful. And much as I'd like to think it is, you know, we've developed it with all the best intention and with the kind of evidence base behind us. We won't know until we try it. So, you know, we have to check that first. If it does turn out to be both acceptable to families and looking like it's going to cause benefit and not harm, then I would like to see that being rolled out within the context of kind of semi-universal services, if you like. At the moment, we kind of seem to have got into a position where the child needs to be struggling, needs to be, you know, showing real difficulties before they're given tailored support. And I'd like to move to a more kind of preventative and supportive approach where we could roll this out to family hubs and service providers and go, do you know what? Your child might be thriving, but they might not. So let's just put this little support in here that really has low cost. It needs to be the kind of program that any family would be happy for their child to go to. I would send my child into this group. This is basically, it's a parent-toddler group, but it's designed to be, you know, supportive and inclusive. If we can do that and just shift that perspective that we don't need to necessarily wait till children are really struggling before we provide support. So I would see that as a big boom.
Yeah, and that fits so well with our first, you know, one of our research goals, which is, you know, support from day one. Exactly as you're saying, you know, what support is out there to help people thrive, not just to survive. I think that's very important. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. If there's any more questions, we've probably got time for one more question if anybody has got anything. But otherwise, I think that's it for today. Thank you for ever so much for all of your interaction, everybody. It has given us a chance to think a bit more deeply about some of those questions. If you found this webinar useful, you could consider making a small donation to Autistica by visiting the Autistica website at autistica.org.uk. On our website, you could also sign up to hear more about future webinars that we've got coming up. And we have a great programme coming up over the year, and also more about the latest research in autism and how you can think about getting involved in some of that research as well. Obviously, we can't ever conduct research without people being involved in that. So if you're interested, please do take a look at our website. Basically, all that's left for me to say is a really big thank you to Alex for sharing her work with us today, and for all of you for your questions. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you all here today. Any useful links we do have, you can always look on our website where there's lots of information on there for you all. But that's it for today, and we hope to see you again another event shortly.
Thank you all. Bye bye.